right. Do we want to dim the music? Awesome, awesome, awesome. Greetings, greetings, greetings. My name is Marcus Sankofa Nix. Delighted to be here at the Enoch Pratt Library of Baltimore City, Maryland. I also want to give a recognition and acknowledgement to those tuning in via virtual. And I know that everybody might not be with us perhaps yet. Some may be trickling in person or virtual. But for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and press on and move forward. Yours truly am glad and honored and delighted to be here to present and share and learn. And when I say learn, because every time I go out and speak and share with the community, it's not just me dishing out and imparting information that I've come across in my field of research, inquiry, and whatnot, but also I learn from the stories and what the perspectives are from those who also are willing to share as well. There's many hats that I wear: professor, historian, educator, healer, activist, storyteller, having a background in African American studies. But nevertheless, I consider myself a servant of the community. The community is very important to me, and I am honored to be able to think about myself as a servant of a number of different communities in a number of different places in a number of different spaces. So we're going to go in and get right into it with the focus and theme in mind for today. Let's heal together, finding new meaning through historical memory or history memory, how we view the past. So finding new memory, finding new meaning through historical memory and how we view the past. So when we talk about history, history is a very controversial topic these days. History is a very polarizing topic these days. History is a very politicized topic. History is a hot button issue. And so we're going to be unraveling the depths and the intricacies of history, how we can imagine history, how we frame history, and really how history impacts us on a mental level, on a social, physiological level, and all the many different ways. And so first, I just want to take everybody on just a brief guided exercise, just so we can center ourselves, so we can ground ourselves and become more present into this space. And those tuning in virtual as well, this is a practice that you could also engage in as well as you choose to do so. But it's just something to be able to be intentional about ensuring that to the best of our capacity, we channel our energies and our focus here into this place and into this space. So without further ado, without further delay, we can go along with this prompt and follow along accordingly. All right.
Hi, I'm Candace Alexander, Director of Health Promotions for the American Lung Association. As a health educator and yoga instructor, I'd like to offer some tools and techniques to help calm yourself during times of stress. I'll be sharing breath and awareness practices that enable you to calm and cool the nervous system, as well as promoting and enhancing clarity, serenity, and deep breaths. This particular session will practice observation of the breath. All you need is a comfortable chair to sit in where your feet can lie comfortably flat on the floor, your back is supported. Or you can sit on the floor with your legs crossed. So let's get started. So as you sit, taking in a slightly longer than normal inhalation, and then letting it go through the mouth with a sigh. Again, breathing in, gently a little longer, letting go even more. And then taking a moment to check in with your body, just to make sure that your shoulders are relaxed and your arms and hands are placed comfortably. Again, taking in a slightly longer inhalation through the nose, and then letting it out through the mouth. And then once again, bring your attention back to the rising, falling of the breath. Slowly feeling yourself begin to rise to the surface of awareness. Stretch the body as if awakening from restful nap, knowing you can return here at any time, or perhaps stay longer now if you like. Thank you for joining us for this practice. If you'd like to know more, go to lung.org or call our lung helpline. Previously, namaste.
All right. So meditation and mindfulness, even heartfulness, has been something that has been influential in my personal walk, in my personal journey. So I figured as part of my sharing, I would also share that as well too with those tuning in with us. So that could be a practice and a tool and a resource that we could use, not just today to center and ground ourselves in this space, but also in further endeavors to bring calm or to settle us and to allow us to be more present. So as we move forward today, just some things to be mindful of as we establish this community and as we grow and look to heal together. Open minded, perhaps maybe some perspectives or some points of view that might help us. Let us listen attentively, do what it is that's necessary and what we need to do to reduce distractions. Let us be present, opening our eyes, our ears, and being in tune to what's happening. And emotions are okay. Emotions are okay. Discomfort is okay. And so there may be something said or something that might be shed light upon today that might make us feel discomfort. It might make us feel uncomfortable. It might even challenge what we think we may know. So let us embrace all of that moving forward and step up and step back. So there will be definitely times that we can share out and have some discussions about what it is that's being shared. So we do want to be mindful of everybody who may have something to offer or something to share. This is a safe space. This is a brave space. And as the African derived concept of Ubuntu suggests, I am because we are because I am. So as we go about this journey and this experience, I'm glad that those tuning in have been able to do so. My name is Marcus Sankofa Nix. As I was just stating before we began our program today, I've been fortunate to grow up in the Howard County, Maryland area as an educator of over 12 years in Howard County Public School System. I'm honored to have also been able to take my community work and go beyond the scope of Howard County into Baltimore City, where I have my dear brother here with me as well too, where I've been fortunate to be able to learn a lot of lessons in the field, working from a community-based cultural standpoint, uh, empowering Black families and individuals from a culturally relevant uh, wellness approach and lens. I've also spent time as a curator in the museum world, as a preservationist, as a historian, as a curator. And so I am delighted to be able to bring a lot of what I have come to research and discover in the field today for our discussion. For the time that we have, of course, I'm not going to be able to present all that I've been able to uncover. Yet, I do have some resources and some books and materials as well. And then for those tuning in online, we'll ensure that you get that as well too also. So I want to first start off with This individual here, Isabel Wilkerson, there's a film that I come to discover that she's even about to be featured in. It's called, I believe, Origin, but it's based on her life work and a book she just recently put out called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And she actually has been known to put forth another well-known piece of literature called Warmth of Other Suns that chronicles the great migration of African Americans post the time of emancipation, how they went up the eastern coast, the deep south, up through the Midwest, where my family has hailed, going from Mississippi to Chicago, and then also out to the West. But in this book here, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, Isabel Wilkerson is speaking about the vitals of history. The vitals of history. She says, quote, when we go back to the doctors, he or she will not begin to treat us without taking our history. And not just our history, but the history of our parents and grandparents before us. Okay? This is out of the book Caste. She goes on furthermore to say, as we will out the pages of our medical past and our current complaint, what our bodies have been exposed to and what they have survived, it does us no good to pretend that certain ailments have not beset us, to deny the full truths of what brought us to this moment. Few problems have ever been solved by ignoring them. So that resonated with me because whenever she speaks about these vitals of history, I started to think about how if we apply for a job, one of the first things that are going to be happening is a background check or a background investigation. Isabel Wilkerson is talking about how in the medical office, before they can begin to treat and assess and diagnose and figure out what's going on, there has to be some kind of interrogation of family history. Even psychotherapists, psychologists even do an intake form to even figure out what are the circumstances and what are the things that have happened before that have brought you to the current present time. So I'm basically building my case to speak to how history is vital. History is very crucial. History is very fundamental. It's very important. I believe it's essential to really examine, to understand how we got to be here on many different levels, on a personal level, on a familial level, on a community, societal level, on a national level, even a global level. And another person I have to bring to this experience today is the voice of Alice Cornelison, who also gives extra context to tell us why history is important from her own words as well, too.
And whatever that somewhere is, it has roots that are important to us. We need to know what our parents did, what our grandparents did, what they thought about, the problems that they came through. Many times we don't understand why our parents treat us the way we do, the way they do, unless we understand the trauma as well as the joy that they have experienced throughout their lifetime. History gives us roots.
History gives us roots. So before we even go further with anything else, I have to take time to really go deeper into history. Once again, history. People all across the country, depending on what educational system or political stance they have, don't even want to talk about history. They don't even want to deal with history. Or the history that they put out is misinformed. It lacks evidence and validity. So a person that I brought into the conversation to help us conceptualize and frame history and understand how we can examine that and explore that is Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who also was born in the month of January, a scholar and an intellectual and a historical giant of whose shoulders that I am proud to say that I stand upon. He says history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History is important. family legacies, where you went to school, what neighborhood you grew up in, your identity, what you claim to be racially. All of these different things tie into history. The continent you were born in. The research has supported that since the COVID-19 pandemic, genealogy has increased. So, history, he says history is very important. It tells us what we still must do, where we still must go, and how to find ourselves on a map of human geography. And we even know that in history, certain groups have been uprooted and been transported against their will other places. So once again, we're still dealing with the vestiges of what has happened in history. Some other voices and perspectives that we could bring into this conversation about history and its relevance are the likes of James Baldwin, who said history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. So he says, a lot of times we get stuck in the past, yes, but what shows up in the present is based on what has happened in the past. We carry our history with us. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about even on a physiological level what that looks like. And then we have Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who does a lot of research with indigenous communities and Native Americans. And she says history is anything that happens up to a second ago. So the re-triggering, things that go unresolved, discrimination, injustice, microaggressions, macroaggressions, the things that occurred, these things going unresolved and it building and building and building and building and building. So when we talk about history, and I brought a few reads up here, there are a couple of books that have been instrumental in helping me to examine history. Of course, these are not all the books, but one of the books, My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem, helps us to understand that history is kind of interesting in the way that it works. We may think our personality, we may think our belief system, our worldview, our attitude, we may think our biases, our thought process, our quirks, the way we do things are just the way they are. But what is argued in here is that things have happened to us, but because we go about moving in our day-to-day realities and in our day-to-day endeavors, we lose context. We oftentimes look at individuals and say, what has happened? Why are they this way? But how are they that way? So when we talk about history, very much so, it affects our mental health. Very much so, it affects our wellness. And because we're a social species and we're human beings that have to interact and engage with each other, what I don't deal with and what I don't address, unfortunately, might spill over and affect my fellow brother. What I don't deal with and what I don't address may carry over and affect how I parent my children. What I don't deal with it and what I don't address might affect how I handle my coworkers or those who report to me, or how I deal with those who are colleagues, so on and so forth. So when we talk about mental health and the connection of mental health to history, we can think about it as involving how we function and how we successfully, or I would say unsuccessfully, adapt in terms of how we perform activities, maintain personal and family relationships, how we adapt to situations, how we handle adversity, our intimate relationships. So history is a big deal. It's a big deal. So on that wellness wheel, when we talk about history, history, of course, is not the only thing, but it's a huge component to helping us understand and contextualize us from a holistic standpoint. Because we see it's connected to the spiritual, it's connected to the emotional, the intellectual, the physical, the environmental, and the financial. And so even with all of those different layers, there's history even associated to that. So there's some books I've been able to come across: Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation, Medical Apartheid, all right? a dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans from the colonial times to the present. So history is very, very critical. When we speak about history, and then we look at history through the lens of race relations, which is what this country, the United States, has been largely built upon and predicated upon. There's no way we can talk about history without speaking about the historic attributes of race relations. So when we talk about trauma, especially historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, we can look at the slave trades, the plantation slavery, violence through the Reconstruction period, Jim Crow, segregation, civil rights movement, hate crimes, unjust laws, microaggressions, and contemporary struggles. And we can look at that and see that that has a physiological effect on the body. When I was working in the museum world, we had an exhibit that had signs, colored only, white only. People that I took in that museum space and those who I gave a tour, they would saw the green book sitting propped up on the counter. They would see other books propped up on the counter, and these things actually brought some of these people back into time, into the 50s, into the 60s, when some African Americans, if you was in the South or different places, had to actually order their food and then go around the back to get served. Or when certain groups had to bow their head when they walked past white people on the street. Even to this day, and I was talking to some family members not too long ago, even driving down south, depending on what dirt road you are or what signs you see, there's a physiological effect from that. Even if you can't articulate it, even if you cannot verbalize it, the body still keeps track. The body still keeps the score. That's actually a book. But the body still keeps and stores that memory. And that's why it's so important to do a little dancing from time to time. That's why it's important to exercise or walk or to meditate or do yoga or get out and connect with nature so that we can metabolize and work through some of this. But when we talk about history, the erasure would suggest that sometimes it could be so hard to bear, we would ignore it as a defense mechanism to not have to deal with it. I don't want to tell my story. I don't want to. The memory is too harsh. The memory is too painful. But what I've said time and time again is that we don't have to be ashamed of our history, because there's resilience in these stories. There's strength and honor in these stories. Even in this picture to the top left-hand side, James McLaurin in the early 1960s, who's a professor in his own local segregated community, goes to an all-white school and gets shifted and placed outside of the classroom, even though he's older than everybody up in that room. Racial socialization, even though his community and his family internally built him up and raised him up so he could know who he was. As Dr. King said, and we just recognized Dr. King, the inner tension, the inner struggle. Or as W.E.B. Du Bois said, this double consciousness, this ambiguity. I've been told by my grandma and my kinfolk that I am somebody. I'm proud of my ancestry or my heritage. But when I go out and see these signs that say white only, blacks, dogs, not allowed. Or when I see the water fountain that looks kind of nice and clean, glistening a little bit, but I see the white one that's run down. I'm a historian, So usually I keep some documents with me. And when we talk about historic inequities, here's some examples to help us once again understand how history still affects us. Because if we don't know where we're going, if we don't know where we come from, we don't know where we're going. Exhibit 1. This is an old school attendance sheet from Howard County in the year of 1912. Allow me to paint a picture for us today in the room and also those tuning in virtual. In this one room segregated color school in Howard County, you have the names of these Black children, and you also have their birth dates. You have some children at this time that are 10, 9, 8, 11, 11, 8, 9, 7, 13, 6, so on and so forth. The age of 6 is usually around first grade. The age of 13 is soon to be trickling over into high school. So you have in this overcrowded one-room schoolhouse where these Black teachers got paid only half amount of white teacher compared to the white teachers. And we see that there was no high school for these Black students to matriculate to. We also see that these children work miles and miles and miles. And even when they did get a bus to go to, they walked a lot of times barefoot over stones and dirt and pebbles and glass and sticks to the point when they got home, their parents had to massage their feet. Walking to school before they could get to their lessons, having to stand around the potbelly stove and dry off before they got to the lesson to sit in those desks that were hand-me-down that came from white schools. No cafeteria, no plumbing, outhouses with the well. That was your water supply. And I talked to some of these individuals who attended schools like this. I sat across from them, looked them in their face. And as the tears came down their faces, they said, it crushed us and penetrated our hearts and soul to finally be bused past the school we were supposed to go to, but we didn't have a school to go to. And we went to what they gave us. It pierced their soul. What is wrong with me? The devaluing, the dehumanization. What I have right here is a slave inventory from a plantation called Reagan Manor, which is one of the plantations, one of the many ones in Maryland. This presentation also is supposed to tie in some local Maryland history too. Well, here is some. This plantation at one point in time had up to 330 enslaved individuals on the land, courtesy of the Maryland Historical Society right down the street. But here's what I would suggest and posit. If we could find a time to give roses to our wife as the enslaver or the owner of the plantation, if we could find time to be romantic and emote and connect and feel that which would propel us to be able to give gifts to our loved ones, where did all that energy go? Where did the capacity to love and feel and emote go to those that were toiling in the fields? Or to those that was quiet servants in a corner told to stay in their place in the big house that they created in the first place? We have to have what King says, moral consistency. But in order to be able to treat a group like this and to treat another group of family like this, we have to justify that treatment in the form of dehumanization. And so when we talk about historic trauma, it's real. Talk about the elements and the different things that we experience, the tension on our ligaments, our joints, our muscles, our bones, our thoughts. So a person named David Williams has said, in terms of Black folk, day-to-day discrimination makes Black folks more susceptible to different diseases like hypertension, kidney disease, heart disease, cancer, obesity, and diabetes. He says that these ailments come at premature ages or earlier. And he says that at age 50, the body of a Black person is 7 to 10 years physiologically older than whites based on the condition of organs and the body function due to psychosocial stressors, economic stressors, and racial discrimination. So when we talked about even COVID-19 pandemic, initially they were talking about pre-existing conditions, till eventually it was uncovered and expressed more publicly that dealing with racism, violence, and hostility can be deemed as a pre-existing condition. But I would also further say that no, Black folks are not the only ones that have been affected by racism. Because it will make a group of people afraid to broach the topic of history and race and galvanized to protect themselves against the dangerous threat of Black folk, well, that would mean that there's also work to do on that side as well, to be very clear. When we talk about just how this thing really has impacted groups of people, the American Heart Association has been able to trace stroke and the likelihood of stroke occurring in populations across the Bible Belt, the Deep South, based on going all the way back to 1860, pre-Civil War. And they've been able to see that up until more recent times, there's a correlation between the South, and Maryland was considered a Southern state. It was just considered an upper South state. Now, I know sometimes Baltimore considers itself its own state. Nevertheless, epigenetics, poor health access. You've heard of the syphilis experiment, Henrietta Lacks and all of that. Well, poor healthcare access, under treatment, under diagnosis, economic inequality. Oh, they good, they're strong, they're invulnerable, they don't need the medication. Not having centers and set up to provide the support. So some say, oh, well, that was back then. That ain't got nothing to do with now. Get over it. That was a long time ago. Well, I was actually stunned to hear this when I was doing work in a local museum as a curator. One of the people that I worked alongside with, who was an elder, who was up in his 70s, pushing 80s, he said, well, Marcus, my wife, she just recently lost her great-great-great-grandfather. Might have been two greats. I don't remember how many greats, but he said he remembered the Civil War, and he just passed away. So a lot of times we think this stuff is a long time ago, but it's really not. But as the concept of Sankofa says, as we look forward to the future, let us never forget where we come from. I believe, just in the same way, history can be a vehicle that can oppress groups of people. It can psychologically and mentally incarcerate groups of people. We talk about present day violence. We talk about hate crimes and injustices. And Dr. Carter G. Woodson talked about, even in the classroom, the worst form of lynching is the lynching of miseducation. I believe history can still give us some hope. Now, nowadays, a lot of us ain't trying to talk about no hope. We ain't trying to talk about no hope. I don't care how many quotes of Dr. Martin Luther King are up in our social media platforms and all that. We ain't hope her. I'm powerless. I don't believe in the system. I don't trust it. And I'm not even saying that some of those perspectives don't have some merit. But I believe that depending on how we look at this thing called history, how we approach the critical examination and study of this thing we call history, we perhaps acquire something called historic empathy, which is regardless of race, class, gender, sexual orientation. Because if we look at just how perhaps there's somebody in our life we may care for and love, imagine waking up and that person being sold to another foreign place and not ever being able to see them again. That could be something that could be felt and experienced by anybody. When we talk about empathy, we oftentimes have a historic numbness. Now, what do you mean historic numbness? So on a practical level, we often forget about what people did who helped us get to where we are. So what do I mean historic numbness? Well, this right here is a snapshot of some influential Black inventions. We sit in a room right now that was where a whole lot of Black folks invented some stuff. And we look at some of these things. And to give some context to this list, post-emancipation was considered the golden age of Black inventions. Many Black folk didn't even get the credit they deserved for the things they invented. But look at our way of life. Sometimes we can get comfortable and not think too much about what people have done for us who have gone before us. The air conditioning unit. How many of us in the room or on screen have ever used the air conditioner? When we think about biscuits, I'm being funny, but go down the list. The clothes dryer, the doorknob, the doorstop, folding beds, folding chairs, gas masks, guitars, hairbrush, ice cream scoop, the mailbox, mop, and many other things. If we don't understand our history, we don't have proper context to the present. And oftentimes, we dare to not even care. I ain't got time to worry about that. I'm trying to survive and make it day to day. What's also fascinating and inspiring is that many of these people who created and invented these things did it under an oppression, did it under surveillance, did it under not the best conditions, but they dug deep and found a way amidst the challenging obstacles to create something that would outlive them. History could be something that can inspire us, which is great. And that takes me to my next point there. History can be something that can give us gratitude. Gratitude. It could help us to be grateful. It could help us to appreciate how far we've come. Now, I know some might say we still have a long way to go. We have not progressed. Things are worse. But it's up to us to continue that fight and to continue that struggle. Connection. History, I believe, can enable us to connect with each other as we tell our own stories, as we embrace our own stories. And I believe history can be a vehicle to enable us to heal. When I say heal, I'm referring to the means of restoring ourselves, becoming whole in our thinking, in our living, in our being. Dr. Joyce King says African American experiences serve as a pedagogical tool and an educational model indispensable to not only heal the Black community, but through the lens and through the eyes of the Black experience, it could be a means in which our entire society could benefit from a wellness perspective, from a health perspective, in terms of our current present day society. Everything has a story. Even the county that I grew up in, Howard County, John Eager Howard, He was a former enslaver. Maryland's first governor, a military soldier, politician, born in present day Baltimore County, and even driving here to the library. I drove around Mount Vernon in different places and still see statues and different things up. History is always talking to us. We see Frederick Douglass, the Maryland native. Look at his face. He's not smiling. He's not cheesing. He's not grinning. He looks stern, serious, unhappy. Even his facial expression is telling a story. The signs and the roads. I was actually recently asked to sit on a committee that actually was involved in looking at neighborhood names, at park namesakes, roads and streets, names of schools, different buildings, and looking at the history to decide if it should remain up or if it should come down. Everything has a story. We talked about that before. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, and they can also repair that broken dignity. So language, how does language affect all of this? How does language affect all of this? I think it's been said that there's been efforts to put Harriet Tubman on currency. Finally, Harriet Tubman, another Maryland native, Dorchester County. 13 trips, back and forth, never got caught. Maryland all the way to Pennsylvania. I remember when I was young, these were the terms that was often associated with who she was. I don't know if anybody can relate in the room, but even the social studies teachers, the academics, and those who teach history have now been called to really further question and think more critically about how we're referring to historical figures. Slave, scared, poor, mistreated, a servant. But words matter. How we tell the story matters. If we put leader on her name and on her life. Labels, courageous, abolitionist, a strategist. She had to know something about strategy to know when to leave, at day or at night. What were those chants and ancestral hymns that would rev up those traveling from where she was up to Freedom Land? Do I go with the children or the babies? Do I go with the elders? They're a little too slow. How do we navigate the terrain? How do we know what to eat? How do we know what not to eat? Slave catchers, dogs, somebody running and going and tattletaling. All of these were things that were leaning on this lady. Yet, she never got caught. And once she got her freedom and once she made her way to Pennsylvania, she looked and said, you know what good is me having my freedom if my family, friends, and loved ones can't have theirs too? She would go on to be a spy in the Civil War. She would lead a whole entire raid. And she was a businesswoman. And as she got older, up in age, she purchased a retirement home and actually took care of the sickly and the elderly in her final years of life. So once we even examine the language we use, because words have power, that can also help us reframe the stories and narratives that we internalize. Let's look at this picture right here. I'll give us a few moments to examine this and dissect this. It's an image called The Hunted Slave by Richard Ansdell. As we look through this from an emotion lens, Are there any emotions or feelings that we can name as we look at this image here? And I don't know if anybody has the capability to put something in the chat, or somebody who's with us in person, feel free to share what it is, what feelings, what sensations, what is coming up as you look at this image right here. Sure, yes. Okay, you want to go a little deeper with that? You want to expound a little bit on that? Thank you for sharing. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to offer up perhaps what's come up for them? Mm-hmm. Oh, is that right? Hmm. Okay. Fear in which way? Okay. Hmm. Got you. Okay. Okay. Hmm. Okay. Okay. Got it. Got it. Yes. Hmm. Thank you for that. Was there anybody in the chat that had anything to offer up? Anything? Hmm. Hmm. I think what everybody said is valid. I intentionally wanted us to look at this piece from a emotion lens because I believe that history is one thing, and we've spent time today talking about history, what it means, what it represents. But I believe what it's going to also take us further to our process of being able to heal and restore and become whole again, as it just said, is to be able to also manage our emotions and deal with our feelings. You said fear on both sides. It's easy to get into our small bubbles, in our safe places, in our groups, and not have to deal. And I'm justified in that. I don't want to deal with those folks. I don't want to deal with those people. Healing could be having certain conversations or putting yourself out there to be, I'm about to use the V word, vulnerable. Now, contextually, to give some historic context to what we're looking at here as we move forward, this here was supposed to depict a scene leading up to the Civil War when many Black folks were leaving the plantations, I think it was very good that you caught the fact that it was light outside. The research supports many chose leave at night, even though, of course, it's not an absolute. There perhaps may have been some that left in the morning. We don't know. Nevertheless, I've also heard in my own time people say that those dogs could represent the system of equality. And when you strike one down, here comes another issue. You struck down citizenship, but here comes a challenge of voting rights. You struck down voting rights, here comes a challenge of redlining. You struck down redlining, here comes a challenge of affirmative action. So when we talk about that, that is what's been told to me before. Then we also talk about perhaps the uncertainty, the anxiety, trying to find yourself to this land that you may or may not know exists. And do you have the capacity to make it there? So faith, not knowing where the danger is going to lurk, not knowing where it's going to occur, but stepping out on faith to find yourself to freedom. One of the things that I noticed before, even in this image on the bottom right-hand side, there's a snake. And nobody, the man or the woman, recognizes that. So danger lurking on every corner. We see this man protecting the woman, and there could be some significance in this piece because this was one of the pieces that tried to show strength and agency for Black folk by resistance and protecting themselves. But nevertheless, our emotions and our feelings are a part of everything that we do. So I would suggest and argue the more we can embrace our emotions and manage them, and I'm not saying it's easy, but the more we can do that, the more we can be able to engage on a deeper level with history. Here's another image. Check that out. What's coming up for us with this one? Stories are told in a myriad of ways. All right. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Mm. You know, there's been some debates on social media. Um, now not on a ton, but firsts. We don't need people being first in institutions. Trying to be first in their stuff in the white environment, the white space does us a disharm. Now, I understand perhaps that perspective. But as I reflect on what was just said, I think we can still also find determination in that strength. I feel that strength too. She got her glasses on. She look cool, even if she's not on the inside. The faces, you got the guards there, armed. The cruel looks. But anyway, what else do we have to say? Is there anything coming up, virtual or here in the room? Okay. And there was something, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think I also heard you allude to also was there was something that they were focused on that was bigger than themselves. by stepping foot. It was those who were coming after them. And the Daisy Bates and the Ella Joe Bakers and all of those who helped to usher in that acumen and that knowledge and that inner strength, they also get a shout out as well too. Anybody else? Absolutely. And so one of the things as a historian that I try to do is by any means not romanticize stuff, but balance out some of these perspectives and narratives that we oftentimes hear. Now, yes, even the research supports being in certain rooms and, you being the only one that might look like yourself, that has psychological effects, has psychological ramifications. When we talk about cultural immersion, I think it's good for groups to take time to be in other spaces outside of their own normal, usual, routine comfort zone, to be able to help them engage and expose themselves to things outside of their limited parameters. So here we are. We have the woods. Imagine putting yourself into this type of situation. You're walking. I see some of us already, right? Not me. Nope. That's okay. How would we fare? How would we feel going through? You want to share? I see your faces saying a whole lot. What you thinking back there? Huh? No? Okay. So there's a lot of different variables. All right, a lot of different variables. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts about this image here? Mm-hmm. Okay. Just depends. Now, yeah, and when I first saw this, it took me back to the days when I camped. I was in Cub Scouts, different things like that. Peace, relaxation, probably, maybe some Zen, connecting with nature. But on the flip side, some might say, well, I ain't trying to put myself in a position to get ate by no bear, no raccoons, or the memory of our ancestors being hung. So the reason why I'm showing this is because different situations affect us in different ways. Different situations affect us on different physiological levels. One person that comes through here, skip it. Another person coming through here, get back up out of here. But I think history and how we go and unpack that may have something to say about how we got to that point to even understand why we show up the way we do in certain places. Forget about the woods at work, how we showing up at work. Always got to be on guard, always got to be on point, scared to make a mistake. How we showing up in our relationships. Control, power, anxieties. How are we showing up for our children? Are we showing up at all? Are we cold? Are we numb? Are we flighty? So when we talk about history, let's now bring it to a personal level, because sometimes that's when it really becomes real. You could talk about the racial stuff, and that's also relevant. I'm not discounting that. But some might say, yeah, but I'm trying to wake up in the morning and feel like I got some purpose, Marcus. I'm trying to just figure out how to get some rest and sleep. I'm trying to figure out how to not be so hypersensitive and hypervigilant. I can't be in the present because I'm still dealing with regrets from the past. Coulda, shoulda, wouldas. Did a little study with some students, and I gave them a little survey and asked them some questions about perhaps future mindedness and the past, stuff that perhaps you wish you did, or you should have did, regrets, all that kind of stuff. In this small little sample size of the group that I assessed, majority said that their orientation and their thought process is stuck in the past. So as I've said, as I spent all this time talking about the importance of going to the past, I'm about to say something that might sound like I'm going against everything that I just said. It's okay to visit the past, but don't get too comfortable there. Because if we get too comfortable in that past, that could become something that may not be healthy for us. So here's just some examples of the way things show up. Some of us might see ourselves on the screen. Some of us may not. But what I oftentimes say, and I'm going back to stories, the power of narrative, what was said to us by our parents, what was not said to us by our parents, what was said to us by our teachers, what was said to us, the images, all of this stuff helps to shape how we show up. A lot of times, as I said before, we lose context and don't even know why we do the things we do. Grief. I created this slide for a presentation I was given around the time of the pandemic, and I still find it, even though we're a few years behind when, things being a little more spiked, I find it still relevant. Now I got to give credit to my dear brother who's with us. He's the one who put me on to this, so I got to give him a shout out. Dr. Dennis Allstar Winkler in the room. Dr. Dennis Allstar Winkler in the room for those on the cameras. Post-traumatic growth. Now, the topic of this whole presentation and talk today is how we find new meaning. But when we talk about the stuff that we go through, grief, when we talk about grief, and oftentimes grief is talked about in terms of lost loved ones or people who have passed away, they transition. But the loss could be in other things too, perhaps like loss of relationships. You no longer have the type of relationship you once had before with a person, or the loss of normalcy or job security. Oftentimes talk about cuts. And will you have a job tomorrow? And because you had one yesterday, or the loss of connection, housing, personal touch, sense of safety, personal space, certainty, mobility, morale, safe energy, all of these types of things. But when people go through stuff, even as we talked about in the previous slide in the woods, a lot of times what's the determining factor is how we go through and carve out meaning. A person can go through a bunch of loss and a bunch of hard times, and that can provoke them to start perhaps taking care of themselves more. Maybe that can help them to start eating better or exercising or delving into history. Same person go through the same stuff and not make it out so well. So it's how we cultivate meaning, and much of that meaning that we cultivate is based on that connection. It's based on being a part of something bigger than ourselves. It's based on having something that we can draw strength from. So I find that history can even be something that could even help us with when we grieve. Some people have said to me, I'm dealing with this grief history. How could I use history in a way that can help me? I've been a part of communities, different groups, healing spaces where the ritual of libation and to calling on the names of those ancestors in your family bloodline, genealogically, or those who are perhaps extended ancestors, that could even rev something up to even invoke a renewed spirit of determination. So whether you're creating an altar, establishing new traditions, whether you're gathering at the grave site on a regular basis, doing a scrapbook, creating a business and devoting that business in honor of that loved one or what have you, there's always things that you can do. One of the things that I've started to pay attention to more are African American historic sites that are getting actually moved in on by developers. And so a lot of cemeteries, barbershops, parks, homes, um, houses where people used to live, so on and so forth, they're being pushed over by developers out of sight, out of mind. So even preservation and restoring African American historic sites. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in Morehouse College for a couple of summers, he went to Connecticut and did work in a smokehouse, in a tobacco um, field. And they say that that experience gave him a renewed sense of meaning and purpose to give back to his community, him being a part of something bigger than himself, connecting him to history, helped to contribute to what he would do in his later years. So there's all types of things that we can do. As I get towards the end, there's some case studies in history that we could also use as leverage to aid us in that process. One of which is Ida B. Wells. We've heard about her, the lynching crusader, the one who was a journalist, an author. She spoke out against hate crimes. She was actually put off of the train, the segregated train back years and years ago. But one of the things that she struggled with was grief in her own right, because she immediately, right away, became the parent of her younger siblings when she lost not one, but both of her parents immediately due to the yellow fever and epidemic. Ida B. Wells do something about grief. But here's the lesson we can obtain from Ida B. Wells using history as a vehicle and a reference point. She didn't just claim defeat. Sure, she might have claimed defeat for a little bit of time, but she turned her energy towards her community. She became a teacher. She channeled her energy into something bigger than herself and left a legacy in her own way. Maya Angelou says in her childhood, she was abused by a family member. But she picked up the pen and said, I have the pen and I can change and rewrite my own narrative. And I say that symbolically and literally. Yeah, she went mute for 5 years, so they say. Didn't want to open up, didn't want to talk about it. That was her process. That was her healing process. But she ended up using her words, her ideas, and channeled that to something bigger than herself. And that facilitated her healing process. Malcolm X. There's much I could say about him, but I'll just say this. When he was in middle school, his teacher said, being a lawyer is no job for a black boy like you. And that was said much harsher. Dealing with the murder of his father, his mother going into a mental institution, foster care, jumping around from place to place to place. Yeah, he struggled with a little bit of anger. He even struggled with the fact that there was white blood that ran through his veins based on his mother's side. But when he went to prison for burglary for 6.5 years, he ended up getting connected to a mentor, Elijah Muhammad, and turned his life around. Now, as I'm telling these stories, I'm not saying that these individuals weren't flawed, that they didn't have things that we can look at and say, maybe things could have been different. In fact, I would argue that the flaws perhaps can make us connect more. The flaws and our things that we don't want to sometimes accept about ourselves can be the same thing that could help us to connect with other people. The more we can accept and embrace all of ourselves, it can then enable us to easier accept other people. So we had a transformation in prison. Martin Luther King Jr., and I'll be speaking on this coming up on Monday for those who want to work their way down to Howard County. Dr. King had his stuff too. They say that when he was a teenager, he actually committed or attempted to commit suicide twice. At times when he gave speeches, he was coming straight out of the hospital. But these errors, or not errors, but these challenges that they faced, seeing them through a humanistic lens does not take away from their greatness. We all have our stuff, even though we like to act like, I ain't got nothing wrong with me. But they say sometimes when he gave speeches, he had migraines. So my point is, even from Dr. King, as great as he was, for those who believe that, he even could use a lesson in self-care and community care. He even could use a lesson in knowing how to sometimes slow down and take it easy a little bit. People tried to tell him. So Ida B. Wells or Brother Malcolm or Martin Luther King or Maya Angelou, these are just a few of many examples. We talked about Harriet Tubman earlier and a number of other different examples of how we can use history and the stories about history. Rosa Parks, how can we reimagine her from a wellness standpoint? I didn't know that Rosa Parks took to yoga. And don't get it twisted, she was an activist long before deciding to sit down on that bus. But she said, you know what? To be around a little bit longer, to endure and to sustain long term, I want to be with my family. So she took up yoga to be with her family more. So I would argue and posit once again that yes, history and the legacy of it, depending on what we're told and how we're told it, it can be demeaning. We could also use history as a conduit to help build upon having optimum wellness. As I get to a close, I just want to show a very brief clip of Angela Davis, and I think we're doing good on time. Let's go ahead and let that run. See what she has to say. You got it. Just play.
Anyone who's interested in making change in the world also has to learn how to take care of herself, himself, yourself. For a long time, activists did not necessarily matter to take care of themselves in terms of what they need, in terms of mental self care, corporal self care, spiritual self care. I know that there were some people who emphasized it. I'm thinking about one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, Erica Huggins, who began to practice yoga and meditation in the 70s. And she encouraged many people, including Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, to join that practice. I think they did a little bit of it, but I think a movement would have been very different had we understood the importance of that kind of self-care. Personally, I started practicing yoga and meditation when I was in jail, but it was more of an individual practice. Later, I had to recognize the importance of emphasizing the collective character of that work on the self.
I think she done said it right there. You can let after this segment, then you get to shut it off. The clicker? Okay. All right.
Entire selves into a movement. It means
ways of acknowledging and hopefully also moving beyond trauma. It means a holistic approach. I think longevity is important, and not simply individual longevity. It is equally important to recognize that as we develop our movements today, we're creating a terrain for the emergence of new activists. And what we do today has an impact on what younger people will be able to do tomorrow. I think we have to imagine ourselves as connected to people who came before us and to those who will come after us.
I think that she has said a lot there. Does anybody perhaps have any thoughts or reflections as to what Angela Davis had to say to us just now? What's she talking about? Thank you. Anybody want to add to that? Or, and once again, this is also to those tuning in virtually as well. Any other reflections on that short clip of Angela?
Speak about that, what she's learned that is important, which is essential compared to maybe some of the earlier ideas around we don't need to do that. As I look at many activists, even today, I mean, I think about today that are still following the footsteps of someone to the left and some, the revolutionary nationalists and the cultural nationalists. Some of the, I still look at some of the habits that are still being, that are still pervasive. She talked about, which I think that what she's alluding to is that if we're not tapping into the spirit, if we're not tapping into the physical, if we're not tapping into all the mental, that things will not be as clear as they can be if we take care of ourselves. Hence, so sometimes we're fighting a war with cloudy glasses. And hence, we might be shooting ourselves and not knowing that we're doing it in the process, thinking we're conquering the enemy, but, or at least attempting to conquer the enemy, but really committing suicide.
Thank you for that. I think about how sometimes we try to be so loyal to our ancestors and those who've gone before us, perhaps freedom fighters or activists or people who've come before. We want to just do everything that they did the way they did it. But I think that we can critique and look at those who've come before us, healers, activists, our family members, so on and so forth. And we can take a look and say, well, maybe there's some things we could take over with us, and there might be some things we could kind of leave back there because we want to go higher. But that could be courageous. And that might not always be easy depending on certain cultures we're in that are stuck in a certain type of point of view. Um, but yes, how can we continue to keep our lens clear and take care of ourselves long term? Is there what else is there that we can say? Um, self-care and collective care. And so I know that there's been talk about self-care. Gotta put on my I gotta put on my mask first before I could do anything, with the collective, with the community. And to an extent, it does help to be able to have the capacity to be clear in our dealings and our endeavors. But what I would also say is that there's wonderful healing power in the collective, connecting with other people, hearing their stories, accountability, all of that. I'll put a plug in. TNAT Holistic Wellness Center. Brother Dr. Dennis Winkler, who's here with us, right here in Baltimore, where we are, Enoch Pratt Library, Baltimore City, on the northeast side of town. That's a wellness center. I can't remember the address, but definitely come through. You'll get some delicious food, some herbs, and you'll get jewelry and healing. There's classes, a lot of different things offered, but tapping into the institutions and the organizations that are also in place to help facilitate that process as well too. Living history. History is always to be continued. And as a historian, I can't have a fixed approach to that which I do. I can come up with all these artifacts and historic documents all I want to. But I even have to be open to know that I may come across something tomorrow that might debunk what I came across yesterday. But nevertheless, in the midst of it all, we are makers of history with a huge opportunity to influence our situation. Let's embrace our untapped power that we have yet to realize. What helps us to humanize ourselves, I think a key ingredient is being able to understand that we have agency. There's a tenet in the holiday of Kwanzaa, Kaumba, the sixth principle, creativity, the Swahili term. The tenet and the statement that goes with that says to leave our community better than it was when we inherited it. We can start there. In whatever space you're in, whether you're a business owner, whether you work at the library, whether you were on your block trying to work with young folk, whether you're a custodian in the school system, whether you're in the church, whether you are so on and so forth. We all have a sphere of influence and a circle that we can influence. With that being said, I want to thank everybody for coming today. And I come with gifts. And one final time, I want to, just open it up and see if there's any final reflections or comments or thoughts about anything. Yes. You're welcome. Are there any questions or thoughts or reflections about, did I give you one? Oh. Yes. Questions or thoughts about anything? I know we've covered a lot. I know some of us were looking at some of the stuff I had up here already before. Make sure you sign the sign-in sheets as well too on your way out. And I'll send you some emails and some things happening on my end and some of the connections I'm, making, different things like that. Yes.
Good job.
Thank you. Okay.
And I don't even know, you spoke about being on this committee, and
Committee. Okay.
and I'll be honest, I struggle with some of the like the renaming of things, right? And I'm not that I struggle that things should be renamed. I just think sometimes we don't keep it 100% real.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that, you know, I was teaching a course, and one of my students said to me, in the text it said something about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, I believe it was, and Hitler, and it's talked about how they were great people for their particular communities or what have you, or, you know, not saying that, and nonetheless, she was saying, how could one equate Hitler and Thomas Jefferson, all these people in the same category, right? And so I responded by saying that, you know, that kind of depends on who you are in proximity to George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, and, you know, knowing the true history is about them. So, and how they aided and evaded slavery and participated in their own ways as owners.
Right.
So then I've also say when we look at these names, we're talking about these Confederate monuments, but we also we have a monument here. So we could talk about down in the harbor when they took down the one who supposedly discovered America.
Columbus.
Yes.
Christopher Columbus.
They took his and they went all down to Richmond and all these different places and saying we're going to take down Jefferson Davis and
Sure.
all these places. I don't think we really talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all these other people. You know that So how far would that thing go? But nonetheless, I'm just saying let's keep it 100.
Yes. Let's keep it 100. Thank you for that. Did anybody have anything to say about that? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Did anybody else want to chime in? So I remember around 2017, I believe, in Charlottesville, when there began to be a lot of talk about Confederate monuments. I think Robert E. Lee and some of these people, and there, I think there was the mass shooting incident or whatever, and then it led for there to be talk about what should happen to these monuments. And I noticed that there may be some desire and attempts to deal with some of the smaller, lesser historical figures, the white ones, let's just call it what it is. But when we start to talk about the Thomas Jeffersons of the world, and when we start to talk about the George Washingtons, oh no, leave that right there. Don't touch that. Don't get in, don't do that. And the backlash and the response to that shows, I think it's a trauma response. It's almost this fear. And I believe it shows how powerful history is, how we imagine stuff. You know, history isn't always in the books. History are the monuments. That's the real history. The streets, what stuff is named after. To take that stuff down, look in history and in time how there's been a backlash. We still have that to this day. Now, some would argue if we take these things down, are we contributing to the erasure? Because whether they were crooks or not, enslavers or not, whatever, if we take it down, how will people ever know who they were? And some then say, well, put them in the museum, but don't have them there looking royal on horses like they were honorable men. Some even argue, well, maybe they were enslavers one time, but at one point they monumented and released their slaves. They weren't enslavers for their whole entire life. They had an awakening and actually let some go. Does that count for anything? I don't have all the answers. But I will say that's the work. To be able to, you know, look at the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons and there's other ones, and to be able to really think about how do I fit in terms of my affinity and my affection for these things, dealing with those difficult truths and realities. It's very, very, very complicated. Last thing I'll say is one of the things I discovered sitting on the commission, and I didn't stay on super long because I had some other things I had to do, but they were looking at plantations throughout Howard County. And there was a situation where there was a family, an African American family, that had a name of a former enslaver. Now, believe it or not, and I actually was a little bit surprised by this, many of the individuals in the family actually decided to keep the name as it is. And I was like, but you know, there was family members who were enslaved, and but they chose to still honor that side, even though it might have been somewhat ugly. That's their legacy. That's their name. That's their identity. And then there were others who were like, well, you caring? So I would say it's very complicated. It's very complicated. And so that's why, as a historian, I try to look at all the perspectives. And I think that even can make people like me unpopular because we just want the right or wrong answer. That's it. We ain't got time to look through all this stuff. Just give it absolute. Is it right or wrong? But it don't always work like that. So thank you for bringing that up. Anything else for the greater good? Once again, I really appreciate everybody for coming and tuning in. Even if you had to drive here a little bit slower to work through some of that dark ice and some of that slush and everything like that, I appreciate everybody and want everybody to get home safe before they calling for some more stuff from what I've heard. But nevertheless, what happened today was meant to happen today. Shout out to Enoch Pratt Library for taking care of me, for hosting the venue and whatnot, and for those tuning in as well. So without further delay, thanks everybody. tuning in and the place to be, and those in our virtual space. Till next time.